Welcome to a special deep dive investigation. Today we are opening the file on the single most defining moment in Australian criminal history. This isn't just a story about missing persons. It is a longitudinal study of how a nation lost its innocence over the course of a single, scorching afternoon. We are going back to 1966 to examine the disappearance of Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont, a case that changed forensic methodology forever. This is Chapter 1, the 1966 Beaumont Search. The heat on January 26, 1966 was not merely weather. It was a physical weight pressing down on Adelaide. At 8:45 a.m., the air was already climbing toward the century mark, baking the asphalt of the Somerton Park suburbs. It was Australia Day, a public holiday, and the rhythm of the morning was defined by the sound of sprinklers and the distant hum of traffic heading toward the coast. Inside the Beaumont household at 109 Harding Street, the atmosphere was routine. There was no premonition of disaster, no cinematic foreshadowing. There were only 3 children and a plan. Jane, aged 9, was the responsible leader, the surrogate parent in miniature. Arnna, 7, was the shadow, following the elder. Grant, 4 years old, was the charge they were sworn to protect. The negotiation with their mother, Nancy, was brief. They wanted to go to Glenelg Beach. It was a 5-minute bus ride. They had done it before. The criteria for permission were simple. Take the 8:45 bus, return on the noon bus. They were given coins for the fare and a small allowance for lunch. At 8:45 a.m., the 3 siblings walked out the front door. Jane carried a handbag containing the money. Grant was likely clutching the toys or towels they intended to use. They walked to the bus stop on the corner of Diagonal Road. A witness, a neighbour, saw them boarding the bus. The doors folded shut. The bus pulled away, merging into the holiday traffic. That moment, the folding of those metal doors, marks the boundary between verified history and 50 years of speculation. The bus ride to Glenelg was short. When the children alighted at the coast, the temperature was already dangerous. The beach was a chaotic tapestry of towels, umbrellas, and bodies. Thousands of people had flocked to the water to escape the oppressive heat of the suburbs. In 1966, this density was considered safety. A crowd was a shield. The idea that a predator could operate within the friction of so many witnesses was contradictory to the social logic of the era. Between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m., the children were spotted playing under the sprinklers at the Collie Reserve, a grassy park adjacent to the beach. They were behaving normally. There was no distress. The timeline fractures at 12:15 p.m. This is the first critical data point in the longitudinal study. The children entered Wenzel's Bakery on Mosley Street. They were served by someone who knew them well, a shopkeeper who had sold them sweets on previous visits. The order was unusual. They bought pasties, but they also bought a meat pie. In the forensic reconstruction that followed, this meat pie became a focal point of intense scrutiny. The children's mother, Nancy Beaumont, would later testify with absolute certainty that she had given them enough money only for their fare and a small treat, hardly enough for a lunch of that size. Furthermore, the Beaumont children had never eaten meat pies before. It was not part of their diet. The implication was binary. Either the children had found money or someone had given it to them. The shopkeeper noted nothing fearful in their demeanour. They were not crying. They were not being dragged. They purchased the food and exited the shop. This transaction implies a grooming phase. A predator does not buy a meat pie for a hysterical child. He buys it for a compliant one. The abduction was not a snatch and grab. It was a seduction. The investigation shifts here to the primary person of interest profile, developed through the aggregation of witness statements collected in the subsequent weeks. Several witnesses at Collie Reserve reported seeing the 3 children in the company of a man. The profile was consistent: a Caucasian male, mid to late 30s, thin face, athletic build. His hair was light brown or blonde, swept back, thinning slightly at the temples. He was wearing swimming trunks, speedos essentially, and his body was deeply tanned, suggesting a local or someone who spent significant time outdoors. The interaction observed was casual. The man was seen lying on the grass. The The children were playing around him. Witnesses reported seeing the man helping the children dress after they had been under the sprinklers. He was shaking the sand from their towels. He was laughing. To the casual observer in 1966, this looked like a father with his children. The social camouflage was perfect. The predator had integrated himself into the family unit so seamlessly that witnesses didn't register a crime, they registered domesticity. At 3 p.m., the timeline offers its final, verified anchor. Tom Patterson was the local postman. He knew the Beaumont family. He knew the children by name and by sight. He was walking his route near the reserve when he saw them. According to Patterson, the 3 children were walking alone. They were moving away from the beach, walking up Jetty Road in the general direction of their home. But they were not walking toward the bus stop. They were walking with purpose, and Patterson noted that they seemed to be in good spirits. They greeted him. He greeted them. This sighting contradicts the 12 p.m. bus curfew. It was now 3 hours past the time they were supposed to be home. Yet, Patterson did not see them running. He did not see them checking watches. They were unhurried. If Patterson's account is accurate, and police at the time considered him a Class A witness due to his familiarity with the subjects, then the children were alive and free at 3 p.m. They were not under physical duress. The window of the abduction, therefore, shrinks to the time immediately following this sighting. They walked up the street and vanished into the heat haze. At 109 Harding Street, the atmosphere had shifted from routine to low-level anxiety, and then to panic. Nancy Beaumont had met the noon bus. Her children were not on it. She met the 2 p.m. bus. It was empty. When the 3 p.m. bus arrived and departed without Jane, Arnna, or Grant, the reality of the situation began to set in. Jim Beaumont returned from work early. By 5 p.m., the parents were searching the streets themselves. They drove the bus route. They walked the beach. They screamed the names of their children into the roar of the ocean and the noise of the holiday crowds. At 7:30 p.m., Jim Beaumont walked into the Glenelg police station. The man who would eventually shoulder the burden of this investigation was Detective Superintendent Stanley Ward. Ward was a man of the era, stoic, methodical, and deeply reliant on the tangible. He was an investigator who believed in cause and effect, in fingerprints and footprints. Ward's initial assessment was clinical. Children get lost, especially on Australia Day. They lose track of time, they fall asleep in the shade, they go to a friend's house. The police response on the night of January 26th was standard for a missing persons case. Patrol cars were alerted, officers walked the beach with flashlights. But as the sun rose on January 27th, and the temperature began to climb once again, Ward realized this was not a simple case of wandering. The search that commenced on the morning of January 27th was unprecedented in South Australian history. Ward organized a grid search of the beach and the surrounding dunes. It is important to understand the technological limitations of 1966. There were no digital footprints. There were no CCTV cameras on the shopfronts of Jetty Road. There was no DNA database to check against suspicious items. Investigation became a brute force exercise in manpower. Ward deployed officers to knock on every door within a 2-mile radius of the beach. He coordinated lines of volunteers to walk shoulder to shoulder through the scrubland. They were looking for the children, yes, but Ward, with his darker experience, was also looking for the blue gym bag Jane had been carrying. He was looking for a mound of disturbed earth. The limitations of the forensic collection became immediately apparent. Thousands of people had trampled the Collie Reserve on Australia Day. Any footprints the abductor might have left were obliterated within minutes of the crime. The bakery wrapper, the meat pie crust, if they had been discarded, they were lost in a sea of holiday trash. Ward sat in the briefing room, a map of Glenelg pinned to the wall. He was fighting a war against probability. He needed a lead. The public response was hysterical. The Adelaide community, previously operating under the assumption of collective safety, shattered. Parents stopped letting their children walk to school. Doors that had been left unlocked for decades were bolted. The psychology of the city changed overnight. Ward felt this pressure. The police commissioner demanded results. The press was camped outside the station. Every hour the children remained missing, the statistical likelihood of their survival dropped by a magnitude. In the first week, the police received hundreds of calls. Most were well-meaning but useless. However, the consistent description of the tall, blonde man allowed Ward to construct a phantom. A sketch was produced. It showed a man with a sharp nose and high cheekbones. It was plastered on every telephone pole and printed on the front page of every newspaper. Police interviewed hundreds of men matching the description. They looked for the specific swimming trunks. They looked for the towel. Among the files that crossed Ward's desk was the record of Arthur Stanley Brown. Brown was a career criminal, a man who drifted through the system. He fit the physical description: tall, blonde, the right age. He had a history that suggested a deviancy compatible with the crime. But in 1966, connecting Brown to the beach required more than a profile. Ward needed a witness to pick him out of a lineup. He needed a fingerprint on a discarded item. He needed a confession. Brown, like the tall blonde man, remained a ghost. There was no physical evidence placing him at Glenelg on January 26th. The system could not hold him. By February, the investigation was stalling. The grid searches had yielded nothing. The ocean had returned nothing. It was in this vacuum of evidence that the investigation took a turn toward the surreal, marking one of the most controversial phases of the case. Desperation opens the door to the irrational. As the weeks turned into months, the Beaumont parents, tormented by the silence, agreed to the involvement of Gerard Crosset. Crosset was a parapsychologist, a psychic, flown in from the Netherlands. The fact that the South Australian police, under the rigid command of men like Ward, accommodated this circus speaks to the total failure of traditional methods. Crosset arrived in Adelaide to a media frenzy. He walked the beach, he touched the children's possessions, and then he pointed a finger. He claimed the children had been murdered and buried under new concrete in a warehouse near a brickwork site, not far from the Beaumont home. He was specific. He described the location of the bodies within the foundation. Ward was skeptical, but the public pressure was a physical force. The community demanded the concrete be broken. The excavation began. It was a spectacle. Heavy machinery tore into the floor of the warehouse. The owners of the property watched as their building was dismantled. The cameras rolled. The parents waited. They dug, and they dug. They found nothing. No bones, no blue bag, no clothing. The failure of the psychic search was a turning point. It was the moment the hope finally drained out of the investigation. The hole in the warehouse floor became a symbol of the entire inquiry, a deep, expensive, chaotic void that yielded only dust. Following the brickworks debacle, the leads turned malicious. In 1968, 2 years after the disappearance, a letter arrived for the Beaumont parents. It was written in a childish hand. It claimed to be from Jane. It said they were being kept by a man in Victoria. It said they were safe. A second letter arrived, this one allegedly from the abductor. He claimed he was willing to return the children. He appointed a meeting place. Nancy and Jim Beaumont, holding onto a thread of sanity, followed the instructions. They drove to the location. They waited. No one came. It would take another 24 years, until 1990, for forensic linguistics to prove the letters were a cruel hoax written by a teenager seeking attention. But in the immediate aftermath of 1966 and 1967, they served only to twist the knife, keeping the wound open, preventing the family from grieving, preventing the police from closing the file. Detective Superintendent Ward watched the calendar turn. January 1966 became December 1966. The year that began with a heatwave ended with a cold realization. The tall blonde man had committed the perfect crime, aided by the chaos of a holiday and the innocence of a time that could not imagine him. He had walked 3 children through a crowd of thousands, bought them lunch, and erased them from the earth. Ward sat at his desk, the files stacked high. The initial investigation was technically concluding. The active search teams were being stood down. The resources were being reallocated. The Beaumont case was moving from an active emergency to a cold case status. though they didn't use that term then. Ward knew that the failure here was not just about bad luck, it was systemic. The lack of communication between districts, the inability to process the scene, the reliance on eyewitness memory over hard data, it all pointed to a need for radical change. As the file was placed into the archives, it marked the end of the initial search and the beginning of a 50-year haunting. The Beaumont children were gone, but their absence had triggered a seismic shift. The South Australian police force would never operate the same way again. The failure to find Jane, Arnna and Grant would become the catalyst for the first major, comprehensive review of Australian missing persons procedures. The innocence was dead. The era of the locked door had begun. But the silence that descended on 109 Harding Street was heavier than any locked door. It was a silence that had mass and density, displacing the air in the hallways where 3 children had once thundered in from school. For Jim and Nancy Beaumont, the tragedy did not end with the archiving of a file. It merely mutated into a slow-motion torture of undefined duration. The house became a museum to a suspended timeline. The beds were made, the clothes were folded, and the silence was punctuated only by the ticking of the clock and the terrifying ring of the telephone, a sound that induced a Pavlovian spike of adrenaline and nausea, forever caught between the hope of news and the dread of another hoax. The public, too, found themselves unable to look away, trapped in a collective psychological purgatory. The Beaumont case had ceased to be a mere police investigation. It had become folklore, a dark mythology woven into the heat and dust of the South Australian landscape. Because there were no bodies, there was no funeral. Because there was no funeral, there was no closure. Because there was no closure, the imagination of the populace festered. In the vacuum of hard evidence, the supernatural rushed in to fill the void. The arrival of Gerard Croiset, the renowned Dutch parapsychologist, had been a testament to the desperation that had gripped the authorities and the media. Even after his departure, the residue of his quote "too" clung to the case like a persistent film. He had spoken of a new building, a brick kiln, the smell of damp earth. These vague impressions, rather than being dismissed as the theatrics of a charlatan, were dissected with Talmudic intensity by a public starving for answers. People began to see the children everywhere. In the months and years that followed, sightings poured in from every corner of the continent. They were seen in a country store in rural Victoria, spotted in the back of a Holden sedan crossing the Nullarbor Plain, glimpsed on a ferry to Tasmania. Each sighting was a spark in a dry field, igniting a momentary flare of hope that burned the parents before fading into ash. Detectives were dispatched to chase ghosts across state lines, interviewing diner waitresses and gas station attendants who swore they had seen a girl with Jane's shy demeanor or a boy with Grant's playful gait. But the children were always just an hour ahead, always just out of reach, phantom travelers on an endless road. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the cultural landscape of Adelaide hardened. There became the boogeyman of a generation. He was no longer just a suspect, he was an archetype of predatory evil. Parents used him as a cautionary tale, a grim fable to keep children close to their apron strings. The sketch of his face, the high cheekbones, the thin nose, the swept-back hair, was burned into the retina of the state. It hung in post offices and police stations, the ink fading under the harsh Australian sun, but the eyes remaining accusatory and blank. Inside the major crime squad, the torch was passed. Ward moved on, his career forever bookmarked by the case he couldn't solve. A new breed of detectives took over, men who had been uniformed constables or barely out of the academy when the children vanished. They inherited the Beaumont boxes, dusty cartons filled with statements, grid maps, and photographs of empty beaches. They approached the case with fresh eyes, but soon found themselves ensnared in the same web of contradictions. The investigation shifted from hot pursuit to cold analysis. The detectives began to look closer at the darker underbelly of Adelaide society. The city, known for its churches and festivals, had a shadow side, a network of paedophiles and deviants that the polite society of the 1950s and 60s had refused to acknowledge. The police began to build profiles of men who fit the description, men of means and opportunity. This was when the name Harry Phipps began to drift through the whispered conversations of the investigation, though it would be decades before his name truly surfaced in the public consciousness. Phipps was a local businessman, wealthy, ostensibly respectable, a man with a factory and a pattern of behavior that, in hindsight, sent chills through the officers reviewing the files. He lived not far from Glenelg. He fit the physical description. There were stories, fragments of rumors, about him giving money to children, about a habit of grooming. But in the late 60s and early 70s, men like Phipps were insulated by their social standing. To accuse a pillar of the community without a smoking gun was professional suicide. So, his name sat in the periphery, a dark star exerting a gravitational pull that no one could quite measure. The torture for the Beaumonts was compounded by the geography of their loss. Glenelg was not a remote wilderness, it was the city's playground. To live in Adelaide was to be constantly reminded of the beach. Every summer brought the same heat, the same rush of families to the foreshore, the same sound of the sprinklers on the Collie Reserve grass. For Jim and Nancy, the geography was a map of pain. The route the children took, the bus stop, the spot on the beach near the breakwater, these were stations of the cross. Jim Beaumont, a man of stoic resilience, found his only solace in the ritual of the search. He did not rely solely on the police. In the quiet hours of the evening, or on weekends, he would drive. He would follow up on whispered tips that the police had discarded. He would stand at the edge of excavation sites, watching the backhoes tear into the earth, his face a mask of guarded hope. He was looking for his children, but he was also looking for an end to the waiting. The sight of him, a father frozen in time, standing on the edge of a pit, became one of the most heartbreaking images of the saga. Nancy retreated inward. The nursery remained a shrine. She kept the clothes washed. She bought presents for birthdays that came and went, piling them up for the day they would return. It was an act of faith that defied all logic, a maternal refusal to accept the finality of death without the proof of a body. But the strain was geologic in its pressure. The marriage, forged in love, was now held together by the iron bands of shared trauma. They were the only two people on earth who understood the specific frequency of this pain. Yet that same pain created a chasm between them. They were united by the children, yet separated by the way they grieved them. Jim needing to do, to search, to act. Nancy needing to preserve, to hope, to wait. By the late 1970s, a new darkness fell over South Australia. The Quote 5, a series of gruesome abductions and killings of young men, shattered whatever remaining innocence the state possessed. The discovery of these crimes revealed a ring of high-status individuals involved in abduction and abuse. While legally distinct from the Beaumont case, the psychological link was undeniable. The public began to wonder, was there a connection? Was the tall blonde man a precursor to this organized evil? The shadow of the Beaumonts loomed over every new crime scene. When the bodies of the family murders victims were found, the first question on every detective's mind, before logic intervened, was, is it them? It never was. As the decades rolled on, the files were digitized, the paper edges yellowing and crumbling. The technological revolution brought new tools to the table: DNA profiling, ground-penetrating radar, computerized facial aging. Each advancement sparked a mini-revival of the case. Television segments would air, featuring computer-generated images of what Jane, Arnna, and Grant might look like in their 40s, then their 50s. These images were uncanny, ghostly projections of lives unlived. They showed Jane as a middle-aged woman with sensible hair, Grant as a balding man. To the public, these images were curiosities. To the parents, they were grotesque reminders of the theft of time. In the 1990s, the police initiated a comprehensive review. They revisited the sketch. They revisited the timeline. They looked again at the quote, 7, a person of interest who had been spotted at the beach, and revisited the connection to the industrial sites. It was during this period that the focus tightened on the possibility of a local perpetrator, someone who knew the rhythms of the suburb, someone who could blend in. The new millennium brought no relief, only the grim milestone of the 50th anniversary. The media descended once again, retelling the story for a generation that had been born long after the children vanished. But by now, the story had changed texture. It was no longer a breaking news event. It was history. It was the Mary Celeste of the Antipodes. Then came the renewed focus on the Castalloy factory site in North Plympton. This was the location previously owned by Harry Phipps. New witnesses had come forward, brothers who claimed that as children they had been paid by Phipps to dig a hole on the factory grounds on that very weekend in 1966. The details were specific, the witnesses credible. In 2013, and again in 2018, the heavy machinery returned. The South Australian police, now operating with a level of forensic sophistication undreamt of in Ward's time, cordoned off the area. They drilled through concrete. They excavated soil that had not seen the sun in half a century. The media helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting the dig live. The entire nation held its breath. It felt different this time. The specificity of the lead, the connection to Phipps, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle. Jim and Nancy, now elderly, living separate lives, but forever bound by the past, were notified. They waited by the phones, just as they had in 1966. The excavators clawed at the dirt. They found animal bones. They found rubbish. They found the geological strata of 50 years of industrial use. But they found no human remains. The dirt was sifted, analyzed, and finally returned to the hole. The police held a press conference. The lead was credible, they said, but the result was negative. The scientific probability of the children being there was dismissed. The disappointment was a physical blow. It was the warehouse floor all over again, 50 years later. A deep, expensive void, yielding only dust. Jim and Nancy Beaumont eventually passed away, leaving the world without knowing the fate of their children. Their deaths marked the end of the primary waiting, but not the end of the mystery. The house on Harding Street was sold, the possessions dispersed, but the address remained a landmark of sorrow. Yet, in the absence of a resolution, the story of the Beaumont children evolved into something else entirely. It became a permanent scar on the Australian psyche, a reminder of the fragility of safety. It fundamentally altered the way Australian society parented. The free-range childhood, where kids could ride bikes to the beach, buy a pie, and return when the streetlights came on, was strangled that Australia Day. It was replaced by the helicopter parent, by the locked gate, by the stranger danger curriculum taught in every primary school. The legacy of the investigation itself was profound. The chaotic failures of 1966 drove the modernization of Australian policing. The lack of radio interoperability, the jurisdictional jealousies, the rudimentary forensic protocols, all were overhauled in the wake of the disaster. A national missing persons database was established. Protocols for child abduction alerts were developed. In a grim irony, the loss of Jane, Arnna, and Grant saved countless future children. Their absence created the safety net that had not existed to catch them. Today, the file remains open. It sits in the archives of the Major Crime Investigation Branch, a monolithic testament to the unsolved. Detectives still review it. Tips still come in, though they are fewer now, the memories of witnesses eroded by dementia and death. The tall blonde man is likely dead, his secret taken to the grave, or perhaps he was never one man at all, but a composite of fears and misremembered faces. But on quiet summer days at Glenelg, when the heat haze shimmers off the water and the Norfolk pines stand motionless against the blue sky, you can almost feel the echo of 1966. You can see the ghost of a bus pulling up. You can imagine three figures, towels over their shoulders, stepping onto the hot asphalt, laughing, unaware that they are walking off the edge of the world. The mystery endures not because of the clues, but because of the void. It is the empty space where three lives should have been. It is the silence in the hallway that never lifted. It is the cold realization that some doors, once locked, never open again. The innocence didn't just die. It was stolen, meticulously and without a trace, leaving a nation to stare at the horizon, waiting for a return that would never come. The narrative of the Beaumont children is a book with the final pages torn out, and in that torn edge, in the ragged uncertainty, lies the true horror. It is the story that refuses to end, the grief that refuses to decompose. It is the eternal, haunting present tense of a hot January day, frozen forever in amber. In the years following the parents' retreat from the public eye, the focus of the amateur sleuths shifted. The internet age brought a new dimension to the obsession. Online forums dedicated to the Beaumont case sprang up, populated by armchair detectives from around the globe. They digitized old newspaper clippings, enhanced the grainy photographs of the crowd at the beach, and constructed elaborate timelines that accounted for every minute of that Australia day. These digital investigators obsessed over the Collie Reserve photo, a picture taken by a bystander that day showing the crowded grass. Was that the tall blonde man in the background? Was that Jane's headscarf? They zoomed in until the grain of the film dissolved into abstract art, seeing patterns in the noise. They debated the geometry of shadows to determine the exact time. They filed freedom of information requests, prying loose redacted documents that the police had held tight for decades. This democratization of the investigation brought both noise and nuance. While many theories were fantastical, connecting the Beaumonts to international spy rings or cults, others were grounded in a terrifying logic. The theory of the opportunist gained traction, the idea that the abduction wasn't planned, but a momentary impulse by a predator who just happened to be there. This was, in many ways, more frightening than the idea of a mastermind. It suggested that evil was not a rare, exotic beast, but a common weed waiting for the right conditions to bloom. One persistent avenue of inquiry that the internet sleuths kept alive was the, quote, 13 theory. Despite the police stating they had searched the dunes, the amateur cartographers pointed out how much the landscape had shifted. Sand had moved, vegetation had grown, landscaping had been done. They argued that the children were never taken to a secondary location, that they were buried within sight of the ocean, under the very sand castles other children built. It was a macabre thought, that the beach itself was the tomb, but it resonated with the primal fear of the ocean's edge. Meanwhile, the police force continued its own quiet, relentless evolution. The DNA technology that had been science fiction in 1966 was now standard procedure. In the mid-2000s, investigators began a process of testing old evidence against the state's offender database. Items that had been gathered from suspects over the years, clothing, car upholstery, tools, were subjected to microscopic scrutiny. There was a moment of heart-stopping potential when a match was found in a related cold case, a murder of a child in the 1970s. It proved that the old evidence could still speak. It invigorated the cold case squad. They re-interviewed the few surviving witnesses of the Beaumont disappearance using cognitive interview techniques designed to bypass the conscious mind and unlock buried sensory memories. One elderly woman, who had been a teenager at the beach that day, recalled a detail she had never mentioned before: the smell of the man. She didn't remember his face clearly, but she remembered he smelled of, quote, 14. It was a tiny fragment, a sensory shard, but it sent the detectives back to the files of Harry Phipps and other suspects who worked in industry. Was it the smell of the casting factory? The smell of dry cleaning fluid? It was a lead that ultimately circled back to the same dead ends, but it proved that the past was still alive in the neural pathways of the community. The tragedy also left a physical legacy on the architecture of Adelaide. The, quote, influenced urban planning. Parks were designed with clearer sightlines. Public toilets were built to be more visible. The shadows were engineered out of the city. The carefree, sprawling layout of the mid-century suburbs was slowly tightened, enclosed, monitored. Security cameras appeared on the foreshore. The unsupervised wandering that had defined Australian childhood was replaced by structured play, fenced playgrounds, and the ubiquity of the mobile phone. When Nancy Beaumont died in 2019, aged 92, it was a moment of national mourning, but also of profound pity. She had lived for 53 years with the void. The obituaries did not celebrate her life as much as they chronicled her endurance. She was the mother of the missing, a figure of almost biblical suffering. With her passing, the last direct emotional link to the children was severed. The case moved from living memory into history. But history has a way of resurfacing. In 2020, a new book was published, written by a former detective who had worked the fringes of the case. He proposed a theory that the children had been taken by a childless couple, raised in secret in a remote outback station. It was a theory born of hope rather than evidence, a desire to believe that Jane, Arnna, and Grant had lived, even if in captivity. It was widely dismissed by experts, but it flew off the shelves. The public wanted a different ending. They wanted the fairy tale, even a twisted one, over the crushing reality of the void. The enduring power of the Beaumont mystery lies in its mundane setting. It didn't happen in a dark alley or a haunted house. It happened in the bright, blinding sun of a national holiday, surrounded by sprinklers and ice cream and laughter. It violated the social contract that said, "We are safe in the light." As the 60th anniversary approaches, the South Australian Police maintain a standing reward, $1 million, for information leading to the recovery of the remains. It is a symbolic sum, a statement that the state has not given up. But the detectives know the reality. The perpetrator is almost certainly dead. The witnesses are gone. The physical evidence has degraded. What remains is the story. It is told to new recruits at the police academy as a lesson in the cost of error. It is told to journalism students as a lesson in the power of the media. It is told to children as a warning. And in the archives, file number 10/66 sits in its climate-controlled stasis. It is no longer just a collection of papers. It is a sacred text of failure and loss. Inside are the original witness statements, written in the polite, formal cursive of the 1960s. Inside is the original sketch of the tall blonde man, his eyes still staring out, challenging the future to find him. Inside are the photos of 3 children, forever frozen in the monochrome grain of a family snapshot. Jane smiling, Arnna looking slightly away, Grant laughing. They are the children who never grew up. They are the ghosts of the Australian summer. And as long as the waves break on Glenelg Beach, and as long as parents scan the water's edge with anxious eyes, the Beaumont children will remain, suspended in the amber of 1966, waiting to be found. The investigation had transformed from a hunt for the living into an archaeology of the dead. The forensic linguistics that debunked the hoax letters in 1990 was just the beginning of the scientific assault on the case. In the 2020s, advances in environmental DNA offered a sliver of theoretical hope. Scientists proposed that if any items from the suspect could be located, a car seat, a shovel handle, trace amounts of DNA from the air, from skin cells, could be amplified. The police catalogued every remaining physical artifact, no matter how trivial, preparing for a future science that might finally unlock the atomic truth of what happened. There was also the suitcase lead that emerged briefly in the late 90s and resurfaced periodically. A report of a man seen walking away from the beach at dusk with a heavy, military-style suitcase. At the time, it was dismissed, too small to hold 3 children. But later, grim analysts suggested it might have held 1, or the clothes, or the evidence. The suitcase became another symbol, like the sketch, a phantom object floating in the collective memory. The cultural impact extended into the arts. Novels were written that thinly veiled the case. Films were made that echoed the imagery of the missing children at the beach. The Beaumonts became the muse for a uniquely Australian genre of suburban gothic, stories where the terror comes not from monsters, but from the gaps in the picket fences, from the silence of the neighbours, from the vast, indifferent heat of the continent. Jim Beaumont's death, years before Nancy's, had been a quiet affair. He had spent his final years in a retirement home, his room decorated with photos of the children. The nurses reported that on his bad days, he would ask if they had come home from school yet. On his good days, he would simply sit by the window, watching the street, maintaining his watch until the very end. His passing felt like the lowering of a flag. The father who had dug with his own hands, who had chased every lead, who had held the family together until he couldn't, was gone. Nancy's survival for so many years after Jim was a testament to a different kind of strength. She had lived to see the world change completely. She saw the invention of the internet, the rise of mobile phones, the change in government, the change in policing. But in her mind, it was always 1966. She reportedly kept the children's rooms exactly as they were until she was too frail to maintain the house. When the house was finally cleared, it was a time capsule. Toys from the 60s, clothes that would now be vintage, books with yellowed pages. The removalists who cleared the house spoke of the heavy, reverent atmosphere. They weren't just moving furniture, they were dismantling a temple of grief. The police have pledged that the case will never be closed in the traditional sense. It has been designated a historic major crime, meaning it is subject to periodic mandatory reviews. Every few years, a fresh set of eyes must read the file from cover to cover. This protocol ensures that groupthink doesn't settle, that a new detective might spot a contradiction that a predecessor missed. It is a safeguard against oblivion. There are still secret files, documents that name suspects who were never publicly charged, intelligence reports that were too sensitive or legally perilous to release. These files contain the, quote, 20, the dark suspicions of detectives who, quote, 21, who did it but couldn't prove it. The names in those files are the ghosts that haunt the police force. They are the men who got away, the monsters who lived out their lives in freedom while the Beaumonts lived in a prison of uncertainty. As the sun sets on the narrative of the Beaumont children, the shadows lengthen across the history of Adelaide. The city has moved on, gleaming with glass towers and modern infrastructure, but the scar tissue remains. The story serves as a foundational myth for the modern state, a story of the fall. Before the Beaumonts, Australia was a paradise of unlocked doors. After the Beaumonts, it was a fortress. The three children, had they lived, would now be in their 60s. They would be grandparents. They would have careers, scars, divorces, retirements. They would have lived full, messy, ordinary human lives. The tragedy is not just their death, but the theft of that ordinariness. They were frozen as icons of innocence, denied the privilege of growing old. And so, the file remains on the desk, metaphorically and literally. The dust settles, is wiped away, and settles again. The detectives age and retire. The technology advances. But the question remains, hanging in the hot, dry air of South Australia, as persistent as the drone of cicadas in January. Where are they? The answer is nowhere and everywhere. They are in the sand of the dunes. They are in the concrete of the factories. They are in the ink of the police files. They are in the nightmares of parents. They are in the history books. They are the eternal missing, the children who went to the beach and walked into the sky. The era of the locked door had begun, and nearly 60 years later, the key is still missing. Detective Superintendent Stanley Ward placed the dossier of Arthur Stanley Brown on the scarred timber of his desk, the sound landing with a heavy, final thud that echoed in the quiet office. It was early 1967. The initial frenetic energy of the search had dissipated, replaced by the grinding, industrial machinery of a homicide investigation. Ward did not look at the wall map, where the pins marking the Glenelg sightings had ceased to multiply. He looked at the photograph of Brown. Brown was a Queenslander, a man whose life was a topographical map of incarceration and release. Ward ran a finger down the list of prior convictions. The pattern was distinct. Brown targeted children. He had a history of loitering near public transport hubs and recreational facilities. But it was the physical description that caused the friction in Ward's mind. Brown was in his 50s, yet he dyed his hair. In certain lights, witnesses in other cases had described him as having a youthful, albeit weathered appearance. The description of the tall blonde man given by the witnesses at Glenelg, the man seen joking with Jane, Arnna and Grant, placed the suspect in his mid-30s. A disconnect. However, Ward knew the fallibility of eyewitness estimation. A fit man in his 50s could pass for 35 to a casual observer, especially one wearing swimming trunks and sitting on a towel. Ward lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the stained ceiling tiles. He needed to verify Brown's location on January 26, 1966. The paperwork was a mess of interstate bureaucracy. The South Australian police were relying on manual record checks from Queensland and New South Wales. There was no database, no instant ping of a credit card transaction. There was only the slow transit of carbon-copied forms sent via postal mail. The investigation into Brown centred on opportunity. Detectives canvassed the boarding houses and cheap hotels along the Adelaide coastline. They showed the sketch. A few proprietors hesitated. One woman, running a hostel near the Patawalonga boat haven, thought she recognised the jawline. She claimed a man fitting the description had stayed for 3 days, checking out on the morning of January 27th. He had paid cash. He had carried a blue vinyl bag. This detail aligned with the testimony of the postman, Tom Patterson. Patterson had been one of the last reliable witnesses to see the children alive. He knew the Beaumonts. He had seen them at 3 p.m., walking alone, away from the beach, in the general direction of their home. He had not seen the man then. But earlier witnesses, those near the foreshore, had been adamant about the gym bag. Ward ordered a team to tear apart the room in the hostel. It had been cleaned hundreds of times since 1966. They lifted floorboards. They swabbed the skirting boards for blood, though the chemistry of the time was crude. They found nothing. Brown remained a ghost in the Adelaide file, a name that fit the nightmare, but a man who could not be placed at the scene. The timeline of Brown's movements in other states showed gaps, weeks where he simply vanished from the radar of the parole officers. January 1966 was one such gap. Without a confession or a body, Brown remained a suspect on paper, a terrifying possibility that could neither be confirmed nor dismissed. As the months of 1967 ground on, the silence from the investigation created a vacuum in the public consciousness. Nature abhors a vacuum, and in South Australia, that space was filled by the irrational. The failure of traditional policing methods, the grid searches, the interrogation of known sex offenders, the analysis of tidal movements, opened the door to the paranormal. It began with letters to the editor and grew into a roar. The public demanded the police consult Gerard Croisset. Croisset was a parapsychologist from Utrecht, a man known as the Dutch seer. To Ward and the seasoned detectives of the Major Crime Squad, the idea was anathema. It was an admission of defeat, a surrender of logic to superstition. But the political pressure was insurmountable. The Beaumont parents were desperate. The Premier was fielding calls daily. The police commissioner acquiesced. Croisset did not travel immediately. He worked first from photographs and maps in the Netherlands, entering trances that made for compelling international headlines. He claimed to see the children. He described a location with pink brick dust, a white fence, and a new building under construction. When Croisset finally arrived in Adelaide, it was not as an investigator, but as a celebrity. The media cordon was impenetrable. Police officers, men trained to secure crime scenes and chase armed robbers, found themselves acting as security guards for a psychic. Ward watched from the periphery, his face an impassive mask, as Croisset walked the grounds of a warehouse site near the Castalloy factory. The Dutchman stopped. He pointed to a section of the concrete floor. He claimed the children were there, buried beneath the foundation, their bodies preserved in the wet cement that had been poured days after the disappearance. The specificity of the claim was its most seductive element. It offered a location. It offered an end. The excavation was a spectacle. Heavy machinery was brought in to smash through the concrete of the warehouse floor. The police stood by, spades in hand, feeling the weight of the moment. If Croisset was right, the case was closed, and physics was rewritten. If he was wrong, the cruelty inflicted on the Beaumont family was incalculable. The jackhammers roared, the dust rose in choking clouds, coating the detectives' suits in a fine grey powder. They broke through the slab. They began to dig into the earth beneath. They dug for hours. They found soil. They found construction debris. They found a few animal bones, the remnants of someone's lunch from the building phase. They sifted every bucket of dirt. There were no bodies. There were no blue towels. There was no gym bag. Ward watched the hole deepen, a grave for nothing but hope. The humiliation for the force was acute, but the devastation for the parents was absolute. Croisset left Australia shortly after, offering vague explanations about interference and shifting psychic energies. The police were left with a broken floor and a bill for the repairs. The pink dust theory entered the folklore of the case, a symbol of the desperate bargaining stage of collective grief. The failure of the psychic search hardened the resolve of the investigation team, but it also signaled a shift. The era of the hot search was over. The trail had not just gone cold, it had frozen. Then, in 1968, the postman delivered a miracle. 2 letters arrived. One was addressed to the Beaumont parents, the other to the police. The handwriting was neat, slightly looped, indicative of an uneducated but careful writer. The letter to the parents was purportedly written by Jane, the eldest child. "Dear Mum and Dad," it began. It described a life of captivity that was strangely benign. The writer claimed to be living with the man. He was treating them well. He was feeding them pasties and meat pies, a callback to the 12:15 p.m. purchase at the Wenzel's bakery on the day of the abduction. The detail was sharp, painful. It was something the public knew, but the phrasing felt intimate. The letter to the police was from the man himself. He appointed himself the guardian of the children. He claimed he had not intended to keep them, but circumstances had forced his hand. He offered a trade. He would return the children at a specific time and place, provided there were no police. Forensic document examiners scrutinized the pages. They looked for indentations, for watermarks. They analyzed the ink. The paper was standard stationery, available at any newsagent in the Commonwealth. The postmark was Dandenong, Victoria. This shifted the geographic focus abruptly. Had they been moved interstate? The handwriting did not perfectly match samples of Jane's schoolwork, but 2 years had passed. A child's hand changes. Trauma changes motor skills. The parents, reading the words, felt a shock of recognition. They believed. Detectives were skeptical. The tone of The Guardian was too literary, too composed. It read like a fiction. But Ward could not take the risk. If there was a 1% chance the children were alive in the Dandenong Ranges, they had to act. The instructions were specific. A meeting point was designated in a rural area. The father, Jim Beaumont, was to drive there alone. The police set up a covert perimeter. They used unmarked cars positioned miles back. They had spotters in the scrub, camouflage netting draped over their bodies, waiting for the blue sedan or the station wagon that would bring the children home. Jim Beaumont drove to the spot. He parked his car. He waited. The landscape was vast and empty. The heat shimmered off the bitumen. Birds called from the eucalyptus trees. An hour passed. Then 2. Every approaching engine sound caused a spike of adrenaline, followed by the crushing realization that it was just a local farmer or a passing truck. No one came. Jim Beaumont sat in the heat, the letters on the passenger seat, until the sun began to dip low. The drive back to Adelaide was a funeral procession of one. A second letter arrived days later. The man claimed he had seen a police car. He had seen a shadow. He felt betrayed. He would not attempt contact again. The children were now his forever. This marked the psychological breaking point for the investigation in the 1960s. The cruelty of the exchange suggested a sadism that went beyond simple abduction. The perpetrator, or the hoaxer, was enjoying the suffering of the family. The Dandenong lead was pursued aggressively. Police canvassed the area, showing photos of the children. There were sightings, as there always were. A girl in a bakery in Melbourne. A boy playing cricket in a backyard in Geelong. None checked out. As the decade turned, a new name entered the periphery of the investigation, bringing with it a chill that made Arthur Stanley Brown seem almost benign. Derek Ernest Percy. Percy was a different breed of criminal. While Brown was a drifter with a predilection for opportunity, Percy was a void. Intelligent, articulate, and profoundly disturbed, Percy would later be linked to the Wanda Beach murders in Sydney, a case with striking similarities to the Beaumonts. Unmonitored children, a beach setting, a complete lack of forensic residue. Detectives reviewing cold cases in the early 1970s looked at Percy's timeline. In 1966, Percy was young, but physically imposing. He had the capacity for violence. But it was his psychology that aligned with the total disappearance of the children. Percy did not keep victims. He destroyed them. He did not seek ransom. He sought ownership through death. Interviews with Percy were exercises in futility. He spoke in riddles. He claimed memory loss. He would smile a vacant, terrifying smile and say, "I might have done it. I don't remember being there, but I don't remember not being there." He was a black hole. He absorbed questions and gave nothing back. There was no physical evidence linking him to Glenelg, no bus ticket, no petrol receipt, just the resonance of his pathology. He became a person of interest, in the most sterile sense of the term, a variable that could not be solved. The years began to compress. The 1970s bled into the 1980s. The leads dried up. The file on Ward's desk was no longer a single folder. It was a cabinet, then a room. The detectives who had run across the sand at Glenelg in their suits were retiring. Ward himself moved on, the case hanging over his career like a persistent, low-pressure system. The children, in the minds of the public, remained aged 9, 7, and 4. But in reality, they would have been teenagers, then young adults. The what-ifs tortured the investigators. If they were alive, did they know who they were? It was 1990 that brought the next seismic shift, not from a witness, but from the laboratory. Technology had finally caught up with the evidence box. The letters from 1968, stored in climate-controlled darkness, were retrieved. A new technique, laser fingerprint detection, was applied to the paper. The police had always suspected a hoax, but they needed proof. The laser revealed latent prints that the powder of 1968 had missed. They were clear. They were distinct. They ran the prints through the national database, which was now digitizing decades of criminal records. A match. The prints did not belong to the tall blonde man. They did not belong to Arthur Stanley Brown or Derek Ernest Percy. They belonged to a man who, in 1968, had been a 41-year-old living in Dandenong. He had no history of child abduction. He was a petty criminal, a man who had seen the pain of a family on the news and decided, for reasons known only to a diseased mind, to insert himself into the narrative. Police raided his home. He confessed. He had never seen the Beaumont children. He had never been to Glenelg. He had written the letters as a joke. The revelation was a double-edged sword. It cleared the Dandenong lead definitively. The children had never been in Victoria. The hope that Jane had written, "Dear Mum and Dad," was extinguished. The letters were lies. But the discovery also proved the efficacy of the new science. The human eye, the memory of the postman, the intuition of the psychic, all had failed. But the biology, the faint chemical residue of a fingertip left 20 years prior, had spoken the truth. The investigation room in Adelaide was quiet. The detectives looked at the timeline on the wall. The red string connecting Glenelg to Dandenong was cut down. The map shrank back to the beach. The realization settled in. The answers were not in the minds of madmen or the visions of seers. They were likely microscopic. The era of the manhunt was ending. The era of the lab coat was beginning. Somewhere, on a piece of clothing, a towel or a bone fragment buried deep in the South Australian earth, there might be a cell, a strand of hair, a biological signature. The focus shifted. They would no longer look for a man in a crowd. They would look for the building blocks of life itself. The mandate was clear, but the path was obscured by the fog of accumulated time. The shift to forensics was not an overnight panacea. It was a slow, grinding pivot that required the reorganization of decades of physical clutter. The Major Crime Investigation Branch began the arduous task of cataloguing what remained, treating the boxes not as archives of a story, but as biological reservoirs. The 1990s dragged on, a decade characterized by a silence that was louder than the frantic searching of the 60s. In the public eye, the Beaumont children were fading from a daily panic into a settled scar on the South Australian psyche. They were becoming folklore, tragic figures trapped in amber, while the city of Adelaide modernized around them. The tram that had carried them from their home to the seaside was upgraded, the tracks repaired, the carriages painted new colours. The Glenelg foreshore, once a simple stretch of sand and grass, began to bristle with high-rise developments and commercial ventures. The innocence of the scene was buried under concrete and progress, but beneath the foundations of the new city, the detectives wondered if the truth lay waiting. Inside the station, the atmosphere was clinical. The passionate, desperate energy of the initial manhunt, the door-knocking, the shouting, the chasing of shadows, had calcified into a stoic, administrative persistence. Detective Senior Sergeant Stanley Swain, who had been the face of the investigation for so long, eventually retired, taking with him the intimate, visceral memory of those first few days. A new guard stepped in, men and women who had been children themselves when Jane, Arnna and Grant vanished. For these new officers, the Beaumonts were not just missing children, they were the unsolvable, the litmus test for the department's capabilities. They began to review the suspects with the cold logic of the new millennium. The emotional biases of the past were stripped away. They looked at the file of Bevan Spencer von Einem, a name that chilled the blood of every parent in the state. Convicted of unimaginable crimes against boys in the early 80s, von Einem represented a darkness that the police of 1966 had scarcely believed existed. Investigators spent months dissecting his timeline, interviewing his associates, trying to find a link, a thread that could pull him back from the 80s to that hot Australia day in '66. But von Einem would have been barely 20 years old at the time. The witness sketches described a man in his mid-30s. The geometry of the accusation didn't fit, yet the shadow of his malevolence was so long it seemed to touch everything. As the years bled into the new century, the investigation turned inward, examining the very soil of the state. The detectives became geologists of crime. They began to rely heavily on tips that spoke not of sightings, but of disturbances in the earth. Every call about a concrete slab poured suspiciously late at night in 1966, every mention of a well filled in with haste, was logged and prioritized. In 2013, the silence was shattered again, not by a scream, but by the hum of machinery. A tip-off led police to a factory site in North Plimpton. Two brothers had come forward with a memory that had gnawed at them for 40 years. They recalled being paid by a man, a factory owner named Harry Phipps, to dig a large hole on the site that very Australia Day weekend. They were just boys then, eager for pocket money, unaware of the date's significance until age and reflection aligned the chronology. Phipps was long dead, a wealthy, powerful man in his time, described by some as having a sadistic streak. He fit the physical description, the height, the build, the demeanor. He lived close to the beach. He was a man of means who could make problems disappear. The site was now part of a larger industrial complex, owned by New Castilloy. The police descended, not with notebooks, but with ground-penetrating radar, GPR, and excavators. The scene was surreal. Bright yellow excavators tore into the ground, surrounded by men in white forensic coveralls and blue police uniforms. The media, hungry for the closure of the nation's oldest open wound, camped on the perimeter, their cameras zoomed in on the dirt. The GPR had shown an anomaly, a patch of disturbed earth, a variation in density that suggested the soil had been turned and repacked. The signal was consistent with a grave. Hour by hour, the buckets of soil were raised. The dirt was dumped onto tarpaulins, where it was raked through by hand. They were looking for the smallest indicators, a button, a coin, a fiber of the swimsuit material. The tension was suffocating. Every time a rock clattered against a shovel, heads snapped up. Every time the forensic anthropologist leaned in to inspect a fragment, the collective breath of the onlookers held. They found bones. The word rippled through the cordon. Bones. The media broadcast the update live. In living rooms across Australia, elderly people who remembered 1966 wept. The Beaumont parents, Jim and Nancy, now in their 80s and living in a reclusion so deep it was almost phantom-like, were notified. One can only imagine the cruelty of that phone call. The surge of adrenaline in a heart tired of breaking. The bones were bagged. They were measured. They were analyzed. They were animal. Cow bones. Sheep bones. Remnants of a time when the area had been farmland or a dumping ground for domestic refuse. The anomaly on the radar was just a pocket of rubbish and debris. The hole the boys had dug was there, but it was empty of the children. The excavators stopped. The soil was pushed back. The hole was filled. The police left North Plimpton, the dust settling on another dead end. The disappointment was heavier than before, because science had promised precision, and instead, it had delivered only a precise view of nothing. But the failure at North Plimpton did not deter the cold case unit. It merely hardened their resolve. They understood now that the, quote, 38, quote, were elusive. DNA degrades. Soil acids eat away at bone. Time is a solvent. They needed to be faster, smarter, and look in places that had been overlooked because they seemed too obvious or too impossible. The focus shifted back to the Phipps family. If Harry Phipps was the man, and the factory was clean, where else could he have gone? The profiling team began to construct a psychological map of the man. A predator who takes 3 children in a crowded public place is not a chaotic actor. He is a planner, or a man of supreme, arrogant confidence. He does not drive for hours with screaming children. He goes somewhere safe, somewhere close. This line of inquiry kept the Phipps name on the whiteboard. Investigators quietly began to interview the remaining family members of the deceased businessman. They delved into the dark, unspoken history of the Phipps household. Allegations of abuse within the family surfaced, painting a picture of a man capable of monstrous acts masked by suburban respectability. This was the new frontier of the investigation, historical reconstruction of character. As the 100th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings dominated the Australian consciousness in 2015, the 50th anniversary of the Beaumont disappearance loomed on the horizon for 2016. The police knew the psychological impact of that number. 50 years, half a century. It was a span of time that turned a crime into history. They wanted answers before the date arrived. They revisited the quote 39. In the original footage of the search in 1966, a newsreel captured a man walking through the crowd at the beach, clutching a satchel, dressed in a suit. He looked out of place. He matched the sketch. For decades, he was just a blur on a film reel. Now, digital enhancement technology allowed them to stabilize the image, to clean the grain. They appealed to the public again. Quote 40. But the faces in the crowd were ghosts. The people who might have recognized him were in nursing homes or graveyards. The image circulated on social media, a tool undreamt of in 1966, but it yielded only speculation. The 50th anniversary arrived with a somber fanfare. A memorial service was held. Jim and Nancy did not attend. They remained in the same house where the children had woken up that morning, the house where the presents had been waiting. They had never moved, terrified that if the children escaped and made their way home, they would find strangers answering the door. They had lived in a mausoleum of anticipation for 5 decades. The police commissioner made a public statement, vowing that the file would never be closed. It was a promise of duty, but it carried the weight of an apology. Then, in 2018, the Phipps lead resurrected itself with violent intensity. New witnesses, new technology, a new specific location at the Castalloy site, a different corner of the vast industrial land that had been missed in 2013. The boys who had dug the hole, now grandfathers, were interviewed again, and their memories were triangulated with aerial photography from 1966. The shadows of the buildings, the position of the fence lines, everything was measured to the millimeter. They realized the 2013 dig might have been off by 20 meters. This time, the excavation was surgical. The South Australian Police, SAPOL, were not taking chances. They coordinated with geophysicists from the university. They used higher frequency radar, capable of distinguishing between a rock and a bone fragment, between a tree root and a femur. The dig began in February. It was the height of summer, the heat radiating off the concrete slabs that had to be drilled through. The noise was deafening, jackhammers breaking the modern crust to reach the 1966 layer. The detectives watched the soil strata change. They moved through the grey fill of the modern era, down into the red clay of the past. It was like reading the rings of a tree. They reached the layer consistent with the mid-60s. The The soil here was different. It was disturbed. The texture was wrong for natural sedimentation. The geologists nodded to the detectives. Something was buried here. The heavy machinery was pulled back. The trowels came out, hand spades, brushes. The pace slowed to a crawl. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but the haystack was tons of packed earth, and the needle was the DNA of 3 siblings. They found debris, odd scraps of metal, a piece of fabric. The fabric was bagged immediately. It was stained, degraded, almost disintegrated. But it was synthetic. Was it from a swimsuit? Or was it just an industrial rag? Days turned into a week. The site was a hive of activity. The forensic lab was on standby, ready to run mitochondrial DNA testing on anything that looked organic. The world watched again. The narrative was so compelling. The wicked factory owner, the hole dug by innocent boys, the bodies hidden under the floor of industry. It made sense. It fit the profile. It fit the timeline. But as the dig widened, the soil yielded its truth. The disturbance was a rubbish pit, not a grave. The fabric was tested. It was not clothing consistent with the children's attire. The bones found mixed in the fill were, once again, non-human. The hole was there. The boys had not lied. Phipps had indeed ordered a hole to be dug, but he had filled it with trash, or perhaps he had toyed with the idea of a grave and abandoned it, or perhaps the bodies were moved again. The cruelty of the lead was that it offered everything except the victims. When the police announced the conclusion of the 2018 Castorloy search, the deflation was absolute. It felt final. The technology had worked perfectly. It had found exactly what was there. The problem was that the children were not there. The investigators returned to the station, exhausted. The red string on the wall seemed to mock them. They had the science. They had the budget. They had the will. But they were fighting an adversary that left no trace. The investigation shifted phases again. It moved from the active quote 41 phase back to the cerebral. The quote 42 era was evolving into the quote 43 era. They began to digitize the millions of pages of case files. Every interview from 1966, every erratic phone call logged in 1974, every letter, every psychic's vision, it was all fed into a database. They were preparing to use algorithms, pattern recognition software, that could see connections the human mind could not hold simultaneously. Maybe the answer wasn't a single smoking gun. Maybe it was a constellation of coincidences that only a computer could map. A car seen in Glenelg at 10 a.m., a ticket bought in Adelaide at 2 p.m., a man buying a meat pie in a specific shop. Data points that, when layered over thousands of others, might reveal a path. While the computers churned, the human element of the story reached its twilight. In 2019, the news broke. Nancy Beaumont had died. She was 92. She passed away in a nursing home, having spent 53 years waiting for a door to open that never did. The tragedy of her death was not just the loss of a life, but the loss of the primary witness to the enduring love that had fueled the search. She died without knowing. The ultimate nightmare of any parent, to leave this world without knowing where your children are in it, had come to pass. Her death hit the cold case unit hard. Many of the detectives had visited her over the years, not to interrogate, but to update, to offer comfort. They saw in her the personification of their failure and the personification of their duty. Jim remains, the father, the last guardian of the memory. With Nancy's passing, a new urgency took hold, but it was a quiet one. The detectives knew that the window for a confession was closing. The perpetrator, if still alive, would be in his 80s or 90s. He would be frail. He might be in a care facility, his mind failing, the secrets locked in a decaying brain. Police began to focus on deathbed confessions. They worked with nursing home staff across the country. They circulated bulletins, not about a suspect's appearance, but about behaviors. Elderly men who had nightmares about children. Men who reacted strangely to the news of the Beaumont excavation. men who hoarded clippings of the case. They were looking for a flicker of conscience in the dying light. Simultaneously, the forensic frontier expanded into genetic genealogy. This was the technique that had caught the Golden State Killer in America. It didn't rely on the suspect's DNA being in the database. It relied on their distant cousins, their second aunts, their family tree. If they could find even a microscopic speck of biological material that belonged to the abductor, perhaps on the original items, perhaps on the quote 45 letters, if the hoaxer had been the killer all along, a theory that was revisited, they could build a family tree that led to him. The letters from 1968 were re-examined yet again. The fingerprint had identified the hoaxer from Dandenong, yes, but was there other DNA on the envelope? Saliva on the stamp? A hair trapped in the glue? The lab technicians donned their suits. They treated the 50-year-old paper like a holy relic. They used vacuum suction to lift particles. They used new chemical reagents that could identify touch DNA, the trace amounts of skin cells left merely by handling an object. The results were inconclusive but not negative. They were profiled, but they were mixed, degraded, complex. The science wasn't quite there yet to untangle the knot of 50 years of contamination. But the detectives knew it would be. In 5 years? 10? The Moore's law of forensics meant that what was impossible today would be routine tomorrow. So, they preserved the evidence. They froze the samples. They waited. The map on the wall changed. It was no longer just Glenelg and the path to the house. It was a map of time. The story had begun with 3 children on a bus, waving goodbye to their parents. It had moved through the frenzy of the manhunt, the desperation of the psychic era, the cruelty of the hoax, and the precision of the forensic age. Now, it entered the era of the archivist and the geneticist. The Beaumont children were no longer just missing persons. They were the silent architects of Australian policing. Their disappearance had changed how parents raised their children, how police managed crime scenes, how the media reported tragedy. In the quiet corridors of the major crime branch, a single file box sits on a desk. It is not dusty, it is handled daily. Inside are the photos of Jane, Arnna, and Grant. They are smiling, frozen in the eternal summer of 1966. The detective looking at them is young, perhaps 30. He was born decades after they vanished. He looks at the image of the tall man's sketch. He looks at the complex, jagged lines of a DNA chromatogram on his computer screen. He types a command. The database begins to cross-reference millions of records, searching for a link between a petty criminal in 1966 and a family tree in 2020. The search continues. It has moved from the beaches to the shovel, from the shovel to the microscope, and now into the very code of humanity. The red string is gone. Now they are pulling at the double helix, hoping that somewhere in the vast, tangled web of human biology, a strand will vibrate and lead them home. The silence of the room is broken only by the hum of the server. It is a sound of processing, of calculating, of unyielding memory. The children are out there, and the machine is learning how to find them. The sun sets over Glenelg. The waves crash with the same rhythm they did on January 26, 1966. The water recedes, erasing the footprints of the day's swimmers. But the evidence of the past is never truly gone. It is merely waiting for the right eye to see it. The detectives know this, and so they work. Not with hope, which is fragile, but with certainty, which is cold and hard and enduring. The truth is not a spirit, it is a sequence, and sequences can be solved. The investigation is no longer a hunt, it is a computation. And the computer does not sleep, it does not forget, it does not grieve, it simply searches, pixel by pixel, cell by cell, until the equation balances and the children are named. The industrial coring drill bit into the concrete floor of the new Castalloy factory in North Plympton. It was January 2013. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched scream of metal on stone that echoed off the corrugated iron walls. But the team of forensic anthropologists and major crime detectives stood motionless within the cordon. They were not listening to the noise, they were watching the monitor of the ground-penetrating radar, GPR, unit. Minutes earlier, the GPR technician had flagged an anomaly. The radar waves, pulsing into the earth beneath the factory slab, had returned a signal indicating disturbed soil, a section of ground where the density did not match the surrounding geology. The area measured roughly 2 meters by 1 meter, the dimensions of a grave. Detective Superintendent Des Bray signaled for the drilling to stop. The dust settled. The concrete core was lifted, revealing the damp earth beneath. This was not a hunch. This was the culmination of a tip-off regarding Harry Phipps, a local factory owner who had died years prior. 2 brothers had come forward, claiming they had been paid by Phipps to dig a hole on this site in 1966, the same weekend the Beaumont children vanished. The excavation began by hand. Trowels scraped away the soil in distinct, measured layers. The forensic team sifted every bucket of dirt through fine mesh screens. They were looking for bone fragments, teeth, buttons, or the corroded zipper of a blue gym bag. Hours passed. The hole deepened. The anomaly identified by the radar resolved itself not into human remains, but into a collection of construction refuse, rubble, animal bones from food waste, and rock. The detectives watched as the bottom of the disturbance was reached. The soil returned to undisturbed, virgin clay. Quote, 47, the lead anthropologist said. The search at North Plympton was halted. The concrete was patched. The media, camped outside the factory gates with telephoto lenses trained on the doorway, broadcast the failure to the nation. But inside the major crime branch, the result was data, not defeat. The elimination of the Phipps site allowed the investigative focus to pivot back to the case files, back to the profiles that had emerged during the rigorous cold case reviews of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The investigation had shifted phases. It was no longer about chasing sightings in country towns. It was about cross-referencing the Beaumont file against the known behaviours of South Australia's most notorious predators. The file on Bevan Spencer von Einem lay open on the desk of the task force leader. In the 1980s, Adelaide had been terrorised by the family murders, a series of abductions and killings of young men. Von Einem was the primary conviction. While the victim profile, young men, differed from the Beaumont children, the geography and the audacity of the crimes required a comparative analysis. Detectives revisited the original witness statements from 1966 regarding the tall, blonde man. They placed the identikit sketch next to mugshots of von Einem from the mid-60s. Von Einem would have been roughly 20 years old at the time of the Beaumont disappearance. He frequented the Glenelg area. He was known to have a prying interest in children during his youth, though his convicted crimes were against adults. The police initiated a review of von Einem's associates. The quote, 51, quote, had implied a network of individuals. The Beaumont abduction, executed in a public place with efficient control over 3 children, suggested a level of confidence that often requires an accomplice or significant premeditation. Investigators traveled to the prison where von Einem was held. The interview was conducted in a sterile, windowless room. The detectives laid out the timeline. January 26, 1966. The 12:15 p.m. purchase of pasties. The 3 p.m. sighting. Von Einem sat opposite them. He offered no reaction. He was a man who understood the power of silence. He denied involvement, his responses monosyllabic and legalistic. Without physical evidence linking him to the scene, no fingerprints on the bakery wrapper, no witness placing his specific vehicle at the Collie Reserve, the interview could not break him. The detectives left the prison with nothing but a psychological assessment. Von Einem was capable of the cruelty required, but the link remained circumstantial. The focus shifted to a suspect who fit the visual profile more closely than any other, Arthur Stanley Brown. In 1998, a cold case review uncovered a distinct correlation between the sketch of the Beaumont suspect and Brown, a sex offender who had been active in the 1960s. Brown had been charged in 1998 with the murder of 2 sisters in Townsville, Queensland, in 1970, a crime with striking similarities to the Beaumont case. Children taken, No immediate trace, a public abduction. South Australian detectives coordinated with their Queensland counterparts. They requested access to Brown's movements in January 1966. Records showed Brown had ties to Adelaide. Witness descriptions of the man at Glenelg. Thin face, fair hair, mid-30s, aligned perfectly with Brown's appearance at the time. However, the investigation hit a biological wall. By the time Brown was identified as a viable suspect in the Beaumont case, he was an elderly man suffering from advanced dementia. Detectives attempted to interview him. Brown sat in a nursing home chair, his mind fragmented. When shown the photos of Jane, Arnna, and Grant, his eyes tracked the images, but there was no spark of recognition, no flash of guilt. The secrets were locked behind the degradation of his frontal lobe. The prosecutor's office determined that Brown was unfit to stand trial for the Queensland murders, and by extension, could not be meaningfully pursued for the Beaumont cold case. He died in 2002, taking whatever knowledge he possessed to the grave. The failure to secure a confession from Brown or von Einem forced the South Australian police to modernise their approach to the physical evidence. Of the 1960s, the physical connections pinned to a corkboard was dismantled. In its place, the investigation moved into the servers of the National Criminal Investigation DNA Database, NCIDD. Forensic science had evolved from blood typing to mitochondrial DNA sequencing. The police possessed a few items from the Beaumont home that belonged to the children, hairbrushes, clothing, that had been preserved. They also had the specific genetic profiles of the parents, Jim and Nancy Beaumont. The new mandate was familial searching. If the perpetrator had never been arrested, perhaps his brother, son, or grandson had been. In 2017, a renewed tip brought the focus back to the new Castalloy factory site. The previous excavation in 2013 had been limited to a specific zone identified by the Phipps brothers. New information suggested the boys might have been digging in a slightly different location, closer to the rear perimeter. This time, the operation was massive. The South Australian government authorised $1 million expenditure. It was a statement of intent. The passage of time did not erode the state's obligation to the victims. In February 2018, heavy excavators tore through the concrete of the factory floor. The scale was industrial. The entire rear section of the site was gridded. Police cadets spent days on their hands and knees, troweling through tons of soil. They found animal bones. They found wrappers. They found the debris of a working factory spanning 5 decades. Detective Superintendent Des Bray addressed the press pack at the conclusion of the dig. His demeanour was stoic. He announced that no human remains had been found. The scientific conclusion was absolute. The children were not at that specific location. The Phipps theory, while compelling in narrative, lacked the physical proof required to close the file. The repeated failures of the physical searches drove a structural change in Australian policing that far outweighed the specifics of the Beaumont case itself. The 1966 investigation had been hampered by a lack of interstate communication and the initial assumption that the children might have simply wandered off. Recognizing these historical deficits, the Australian Federal Police and state jurisdictions established the National Missing Persons Coordination Centre, NMPCC. The protocols for missing children were rewritten entirely. The approach was abolished. Under the new doctrine, a report of missing children under suspicious circumstances triggered an immediate, multi-agency response. The concept of the, quote, 54, the first hour after disappearance, became central to police training. The chaos of Glenelg Beach, with civilians trampling evidence and disparate reports filed at different stations, was replaced by rigid command and control structures. The Beaumont case became a syllabus. At the police academy, recruits studied the timeline of January 26, 1966, not just as history, but as a case study in evidence management and media control. They analyzed the witness interviews, learning how memory contamination occurs when sketches are released prematurely or when media speculation bleeds into witness recollection. By 2020, the investigation had entered the realm of pure data. The South Australian Police announced a partnership with international forensic genealogy labs. The goal was to re-examine the few biological traces found on items associated with other suspects and cross-match them against public genealogy databases, the same method used to catch the Golden State Killer in the United States. A hair found on a towel, a microscopic skin cell on a discarded item near the beach. These fragments, previously useless, were now potential keys. The detectives were no longer looking for a man in a crowd, they were looking for a sequence in a database. The cultural impact of the case had solidified into a permanent psychological architecture. The quote campaigns of the 1970s and 80s, a direct result of the Beaumont and subsequent Ratcliffe-Gordon disappearances, had fundamentally altered Australian childhood. The image of the three children walking alone to the beach was no longer seen as a picture of freedom, but as a picture of negligence. Parents who were children in 1966 now watched their grandchildren with a vigilance born of that summer. The radius of unaccompanied play had shrunk from miles to meters. The tall, blonde man had not just stolen three children, he had stolen the concept of the safe public space. In the evidence room, the box remained. The leads involving the satin man, the grandmother's letters, and the psychic visions had all been stripped away by the rigor of modern forensics. What remained were the immutable facts. Three children went to the beach, they bought food, they were seen with a man, and they vanished. Detective Superintendent Ward, long retired and eventually deceased, had passed the torch through generations of investigators. The current team did not view the case with the emotional rawness of 1966, but with a clinical determination. They knew that offenders from that era were dying out. The window for a confession was closing. The window for science, however, was opening wider. The investigation remains active. It is not a cold case in the sense of being forgotten. It is a cold case in the sense of being frozen in time, waiting for the precise technological heat to thaw the final clue. Every time a new DNA technology is validated, the Beaumont samples are retested. Every time an unidentified set of remains is found anywhere in Australia, they are checked against the Beaumont DNA profile. The file sits on the desk. The search algorithms run in the background, scanning, matching, calculating. The case remains open, serving as the primary driver for modern Australian cold case methodology. And so, the investigation has transformed from a frantic, on-the-ground manhunt into a quiet, high-stakes game of data attrition. The Major Crime Investigation Branch in Adelaide serves as the custodian of this suspended grief, housing the physical manifestation of the mystery, a sprawling archive that has outlived many of the men who first compiled it. To understand the weight of this case on the modern psyche, one must look beyond the abstract notion of methodology and into the physical reality of the files themselves. They are not merely folders, they are a topographic map of frustration. The paperwork spans decades of changing bureaucratic standards. There are the typed, onion skin reports of the 1960s, the keys striking the paper with such force that the periods punched holes through the sheets, smelling faintly of old carbon and tobacco smoke, relics of an era when policing was a visceral, analog trade. These segue into the dot matrix printouts of the 1980s, the edges perforated and tearing, and finally, the crisp, laser-printed summaries of the modern era, bound in plastic, sterile and precise. For the current detectives, the daily routine involves a kind of forensic archaeology. They are not just investigating a crime, they are investigating the investigation. They scour the margins of old notebooks for scribbled phone numbers that were never called. They analyze the handwriting of deceased constables, looking for the hesitation in a signature that might imply doubt about a witness statement. The digitization of these records was a monumental task, a process of converting 3 young lives and 50 years of sorrow into terabytes of searchable text. But this digital conversion allowed for something the original detectives could never have achieved: the ability to cross-reference instantaneously. An algorithm can now spot a name mentioned in a witness statement from 1967 that appears again, peripherally, in a seemingly unrelated sex offense report from 1982. Connections that the human mind, burdened by fatigue and the passage of time, might miss. the machine sees with cold, mathematical clarity. One of the most significant applications of this modern rigor occurred during the excavation of the new Castalloy factory site in North Plympton in 2018. This event served as a brutal microcosm of the entire Beaumont saga, a surge of electrifying hope followed by a crushing, hollow silence. The lead, involving the suspect Harry Phipps, had been compelling. Phipps, a local businessman who died in 2004, had retroactively become a person of interest due to allegations of sexual abuse and the geographical proximity of his factory to the children's route. The theory was seductive in its logic: a wealthy man, a factory floor that could hide anything, and a timeline that fit. When the excavation began, it was a spectacle that arrested the nation. The media descended upon the industrial site with a fervor that echoed the chaos of Glenelg Beach in 1966. News helicopters chopped the air overhead, their cameras zooming in on the patches of concrete being marked with spray paint. Ground-penetrating radar had identified an anomaly, a patch of disturbed earth beneath the concrete slab that did not match the surrounding geological density. To the layperson, it was just soil. To the investigators and the public, it was the potential resting place of Jane, Arnna, and Grant. The digging was performed with surgical care. This was not the brute force of construction, it was the delicate brushwork of forensic anthropology. Officers in white coveralls moved like ghosts against the backdrop of the grey industrial fence. They sifted the earth by hand, bucket by bucket. Every bone fragment recovered sent a shockwave through the command center, requiring immediate analysis. Was it human? Was it juvenile? Time and again, the answer came back: animal. A sheep bone, a remnant of a worker's lunch from decades prior, a piece of domestic refuse. The psychological toll of the North Plympton dig was immense. For a week, Australia held its breath. The parents, Jim and Nancy, were elderly and frail, living in a twilight of their own making, separated but bound by the tragedy. The possibility that they might finally have an answer, that they might be able to bury their children before they themselves were buried, hung in the air like a physical weight. When the dig concluded and the commander announced that nothing of significance had been found, the collective deflation was palpable. It was a repetition of the trauma, a reopening of the wound. The quote 57 in the soil was just that: a geological hiccup, a pocket of loose fill, a phantom. Yet, even in failure, the methodology proved its worth. The comprehensive exclusion of the Castalloy site allowed the detectives to close a massive door. In the logic of cold cases, a closed door is progress, however bitter. It forces the gaze elsewhere. It narrows the field. The focus shifts then, inevitably, back to the quote 58. He is perhaps the most famous ghost in Australian history. The composite sketch, created from witness descriptions in the days following the disappearance, shows a man with a thin face, high cheekbones, and swept-back hair. He is estimated to be in his mid-30s during that summer of 1966. If he is alive today, he is a very old man, perhaps in his late 80s or 90s. He may be in a nursing home, his memory fading, the dark secret of that Australia day locked behind the plaque of dementia. Or, more likely, he is dead, his bones resting in a marked grave, his name carved in stone, mourned by a family who never knew the monster that lived within him. Modern behavioral profiling has attempted to flesh out this sketch. Profilers suggest he was local, or at least intimately familiar with Glenelg. He was comfortable with children, able to gain their trust quickly. Witnesses saw them playing with him, the youngest, Grant, laughing. This implies a predator of the, quote, 59 variety, not a blitz attacker who snatches victims violently. He bought them meat pies. He helped them dress after their swim. This terrifying intimacy suggests a man who may have had children of his own, or who worked in a profession that gave him access and authority. The investigation has also had to grapple with the cruelty of the hoaxers. No history of the Beaumont case is complete without examining the, quote, 60 of 1968. 2 years after the children vanished, Jim Beaumont received letters purportedly written by Jane, stating that they were being held by a man who treated them well. The handwriting was erratic, the tone desperate. For a brief, shining moment, Jim and Nancy believed their children were alive. The police analysis at the time was inconclusive. It was only decades later, through the advancement of fingerprinting technology, that the letters were definitively proven to be a hoax, written by a 41-year-old man who had presumably derived some sick gratification from the parents' torture. This revelation, coming so late, was a double-edged sword. It cleared up a mystery, but it confirmed that during those critical early years, resources had been diverted to a phantom lead while the real trail grew cold. The tragedy of the parents, Jim and Nancy Beaumont, forms the emotional bedrock upon which the entire case rests. Their story is a slow-motion study in endurance. In the years immediately following 1966, they became iconic figures of grief. Nancy, often photographed with a handkerchief to her face, and Jim, stoic and hollow-eyed, represented every parent's worst nightmare. They kept the children's rooms exactly as they had been left. The beds were made, the toys dusted, the clothes folded. It was a shrine to a suspended childhood. They refused to move house for years. The logic was heartbreakingly simple. If the children escaped, or if they were released, they would head for the only home they knew. If Jim and Nancy moved, the children might return to a stranger's door. So they stayed. They endured the silence of the house, the empty chairs at the table, the birthdays that passed without celebration. Eventually, the strain broke the marriage. They separated, living out their remaining years in private orbits of sorrow. Nancy Beaumont died in 2019, at the age of 92. She passed away without ever knowing what happened to Jane, Arnna, and Grant. Her death marked a significant turning point in the psychological landscape of the case. For 5 decades, the investigation had an implicit deadline: find them for Nancy. When she died, that deadline expired. The motivation shifted from compassionate closure for the mother to a matter of historical record and justice for the children themselves. Jim Beaumont, now in his 90s, remains the last living link to the pre-tragedy world. The detectives feel the ticking of that clock intensely. The geography of the disappearance, Glenelg Beach, has also undergone a transformation, yet it remains haunted. Today, the beach is a bustling hub of tourism. The tram still runs from the city to the sea, just as it did when the children took it that morning. But the atmosphere is different. CCTV cameras watch the promenade. The Surf Life Saving Club is a modern fortress of vigilance. The quote 61, the hostel where the children were allegedly seen, is long gone, replaced by development. However, for those who know the history, the beach is a palimpsest. One cannot walk past the Collie Reserve without seeing the spectral image of 3 children lying on the grass, drying off in the sun. One cannot look at the jetty without imagining the tall blonde man watching, waiting. The case is woven into the terrified DNA of the suburb. Every Australia Day, when the heat rises and the cicadas sing, the air in Adelaide feels heavy with the memory. It is a season of national celebration that, in South Australia, is permanently underscored by a minor key of mourning. The legacy mentioned earlier cannot be overstated. Before the Beaumonts, Australian suburbs were perceived as extensions of the backyard. The street was a communal playground. After the Beaumonts, and compounded by the later abduction of unsuspecting children from the Adelaide Oval, the Ratcliffe-Gordon case, the street became a hunting ground. The quote became the quote. This shift had cascading effects on urban planning, education, and parenting styles. High fences went up. The walk to school became the drive to school. The unsupervised Saturday afternoon vanished. In a very real sense, the tall blonde man killed the quintessential Australian childhood of the mid-20th century. Modern detectives are now looking at the case through the lens of genetic genealogy, the technique referenced in the search for the Golden State Killer. This is the new frontier. The South Australian police have partnered with international laboratories to explore the possibility of constructing a, quote, 65, quote, from even the most degraded DNA samples found on items that might be connected to the case. It is a long shot. The physical evidence is sparse. The towels, the bag, the clothing, none of these were found. What remains are trace elements from potential suspect vehicles or locations, fragments that require amplification to be readable. But the science is evolving faster than the evidence is degrading. Techniques that were science fiction in 2010 are standard practice in 2024. Phenotyping, the ability to predict physical appearance, eye color, hair color, facial geometry from a DNA sample, is being considered. If a biological sample from a suspect exists, they could potentially generate a face to compare against the 1966 sketch. It is a race between the degradation of molecules and the acceleration of silicon. There is also the quote, 66 criminal psychologists argue that perpetrators of such crimes rarely keep the secret entirely to themselves. They talk, they boast, they hint. Perhaps not to the police, but to a spouse, a cellmate, or a child. As the generation of the 1960s passes away, children are cleaning out their parents' attics. They are finding diaries, photos, strange souvenirs. The police hotline receives calls every year from people who have found something disturbing in a deceased father's estate. A sudden realization that the quote 67 or the quote 68 fit the description. One such lead involved a man who had allegedly dug a large hole in his backyard in 1966, ostensibly for a swimming pool that was never installed. Decades later, the property owners allowed ground-penetrating radar, another anomaly, another excavation, another disappointment. But the willingness of the public to come forward, to scrutinize their own family histories, speaks to the enduring grip of the case. It has become a collective responsibility. The investigation has also expanded to re-examine the quote 69 cases. The disappearance of Joanne Ratcliffe and Kirsty Gordon from Adelaide Oval in 1973 bears striking resemblances. The brazenness of the abduction, the public setting, the inability of witnesses to intervene. Were they the work of the same man? Or was Adelaide, for a specific window of time, a breeding ground for a specific type of monster? Cross-referencing the files of the Beaumonts with the Oval abductions is a constant task. Detectives look for the quote 70, not just the method of abduction, but the psychological gratification sought by the offender. In the quiet hum of the evidence room, the box labeled quote 71 sits not as a relic, but as a challenge. It is surrounded by the ghosts of technology past, reel-to-reel tapes of interviews with witnesses who are long dead, glass slides of crime scenes that have since been built over. Yet, the current investigators approach it with a lack of sentimentality that is their greatest asset. They do not carry the trauma of the original search, they carry the precision of the new century. They know that the solution, if it comes, will likely not be a dramatic door-kick raid. It will be a notification on a screen, a match percentage, a probabilistic spike in a dataset. It will be the result of a lab technician in a clean room thousands of miles away, staring at a sequence of nucleotides and realizing that the math has finally aligned. Until then, the algorithms run. They churn through the data of the unidentifiable dead found across the continent. Every John Doe found in the scrubland of the Nullarbor, every bone washed up on the finalized coast of Tasmania, is digitally introduced to Jane, Arnna, and Grant. The computer asks the question millions of times a day, quote 72, quote, and millions of times a day, the answer is, quote 73, quote. But the machine does not get tired, it does not get discouraged, it does not grieve. It simply moves to the next data point, searching for the quote 74 quote that will break the silence of half a century. This persistence is the legacy of the Beaumont children. They have forced the Australian justice system to evolve, to sharpen its tools, to refuse the comfort of forgetting. They are the silent architects of modern forensic protocol, their absence a constant presence that ensures no other child's disappearance is ever treated with anything less than total, exhausting, scientific devotion. The file remains on the desk, not because the detectives can't let go, but because the science has finally caught up to the sorrow. The heat of the 1966 summer has dissipated, but the technological heat is rising, burning away the shadows, inching closer, pixel by pixel, to the truth. The narrative of the Beaumont children is often framed as a loss of innocence, but in the cold light of the modern investigation, it reveals itself as something more complex, a loss of ambiguity. In 1966, a man could disappear into the crowd. Today, he leaves a digital and biological wake that never truly settles. The quote 75 exists in the gap between these two worlds. He belongs to the era of cash transactions, rotary phones, and paper tickets, an analog phantom in a digital age. But he is being hunted by tools he could not have conceived of. Consider the specific texture of the quote 76 lead that consumed detectives for years. This suspect, a wealthy industrialist, was named for the satin material found in his car, a detail that seemed to resonate with the neat, folded clothes the children supposedly had. For years, this lead was driven by intuition and circumstance. Detectives quote 77, he was good for it. They liked him for the crime. In the modern room, quote 78, are discarded. The satin man is reduced to data points. Was his car really there? Does the soil on his former property match the mineral composition of the beach sand? Did he have a genetic marker that appears in the population of interest? The romance of the hunch has been replaced by the tyranny of the fact. There is a particular melancholy in the audio archives of the case. Digitized now, one can listen to the voices of the 1960s. The accents are different, broader, slower, the vowels flatter, capturing an Australia that felt isolated from the world. You hear the bus driver, the postman, the shopkeeper at Wenzel's bakery who sold the children their pasties and pies. I served them. The voice crackles through the static. They were happy, just normal kiddies. Listening to these tapes is like listening to a play where the audience knows the ending, but the actors do not. You want to scream at the shopkeeper, keep them there, don't let them leave. But the tape spools on, indifferent. The forensic review has also turned its eye toward the ocean itself. For decades, a prevailing theory was that the children had simply drowned, and the man seen with them was a red herring or a good Samaritan who failed. Oceanographic modeling has been employed to simulate the tides and currents of January 26, 1966. If 3 bodies went into the water at Glenelg, where would they drift? Where would they make landfall? The model suggests that it is highly improbable for 3 bodies to vanish without a trace in such populated waters. The ocean usually gives back what it takes. This lack of return reinforces the darkest conclusion. They were taken inland. They were taken away from the cleansing, chaotic ocean and into the static, controlled environment of a human predator. This realization shifts the psychological profile of the offender. A drowner is an accident of nature. An abductor is an architect of pain. To take 3 children requires logistical confidence. It requires a vehicle. It requires a place to go. It requires the ability to control 3 distinct personalities: Jane, the responsible eldest, Arnna, the middle child, and Grant, the youngest. How did he keep them quiet? The quote 81 aspect of the abduction is studied in academies today. Did he use a ruse, quote 82, or did he use fear, the threat of violence against one to silence the others? The file contains grim speculations on this dynamic, drawn from comparisons with confirmed multiple abduction cases. The sheer volume of false leads documented in the file is a testament to the chaos of memory. Over the years, hundreds of people have claimed to be the children. Women with vague memories of abuse, men with gaps in their childhood history. Each claimant must be treated with respect, yet each requires resources to vet. DNA tests are discreetly performed. Hopes are raised and dashed in the privacy of a sterile room. It is a quiet cruelty, this parade of broken people looking for an identity, hoping that their personal trauma explains the national tragedy. But the DNA never matches. They are victims, certainly, but not the victims the police are looking for. In the margins of the case, there are the 83 witnesses, the people who almost went to the beach that day, the people who almost spoke to the man. These individuals, now elderly, carry a burden of survivor's guilt. If I had looked longer, they say in interviews, if I had asked him who he was. The investigation has had to manage this psychological debris as well, separating genuine recollection from the guilt-induced fabrication that memory often constructs over time. The human mind abhors a vacuum. Where there is a lack of detail, the brain invents it. Detectives have to peel back these layers of invention to get to the raw, unvarnished observation. The police have also utilized environmental profiling. They have mapped the vegetation of 1966 Adelaide. If pollen was found on a preserved item, could it pinpoint a location? The pursuit of truth has gone down to the level of the spore. Archival weather data, soil pH levels, the migration patterns of local fauna, everything is fair game. The environment is a witness that cannot lie, but it speaks a language that requires immense translation. As the years roll on, the Beaumont case has engaged in a strange osmosis with Australian art and literature. Novels have been written that thinly veil the facts. Movies have been made that capture the mood of the lost child. This cultural metabolization helps keep the case alive in the public consciousness, but it also blurs the lines. Detectives must constantly guard against narrative contamination, where tips from the public are based on a TV show they watched rather than a genuine memory. The fiction feeds the fact, and the fact feeds the fiction, creating a feedback loop that the cold case unit must carefully filter. Yet, despite the noise, the signal remains. 3 distinct DNA profiles. The essence of Jane, Arnna, and Grant is immortalized in alphanumeric strings. These strings are their proxy. They are sent out into the world, traveling through fiber optic cables to databases in Houston, in London, in Canberra. They are the travelers that the children never got to be. The team currently assigned to the case knows that they are likely the final generation of investigators to work it, while the perpetrator could theoretically be alive. Soon, the case will transition from active cold case to historical cold case. The difference is subtle but profound. An active case seeks a prosecution. A historical case seeks a resolution. When the suspect pool is universally deceased, the handcuffs are put away, and the shovel is the only tool left. The goal shifts from justice to recovery, but for now the window is a sliver, not yet shut. There is always the chance of the deathbed confession. A nurse in a palliative care ward hears a whisper. A priest in a confessional is burdened with a secret he can finally release upon the penitent's death. The police maintain relationships with aged care facilities, with clergy, with the whispered networks of the elderly. They are listening for the final exhale of a guilty conscience. And so the file sits. It is a heavy, paper and digital beast that demands to be fed. It consumes time, money, and emotional energy. But it also gives something back. It gives the South Australian Police a standard of excellence. It reminds every rookie constable that a missing child is an emergency that never truly ends. It reminds the public that the community is the first line of defence. The beach at Glenelg is beautiful today. The water is a brilliant turquoise blue. Children run on the sand, their screams of joy indistinguishable from screams of fear if one is listening from too far away. Parents sit on the grass watching. They check their phones, then they check their children. Look down, look up. Look down, look up. A rhythm of surveillance instilled by a summer 50 years ago. The tall blonde man stole the children, but he gave us the vigilance. It is a terrible trade, a transaction no one wanted, but it is the one we are left with. The search algorithms continue their silent vigil. Somewhere in the vast, chaotic data of the world, there is a connection waiting to be made. A strand of hair in an evidence bag, a sequence of code in a server, a memory in a dying mind. The components of the solution are all present, they simply haven't collided yet. The detectives wait for that collision. They wait for the heat to rise. They wait for the moment when the frozen past finally melts into the clarity of the present, and the 3 children of Adelaide can finally, after all this time, come home.